Good evening and welcome. Welcome to the U.S. Embassy's Information Resource Center. My name is Brian Geibel. I'm the Cultural Affairs Officer, or Cultural Attaché here at the U.S. Embassy in Seoul. I'm also honored to be the Treasurer of the Fulbright Commission here. The U.S. Embassy works very closely with Fulbright, hand in hand, and we're very honored to have such a big group today and such a fabulous topic and a wonderful speaker. But I'll save the introductions for in just a moment. I want to turn over to Mrs. Shim, who's of course, Shim Jae-ok, the Executive Director of Fulbright, the heart and soul of Fulbright. Without her, I'm not sure Fulbright would be running as strong as it is today. So, again, thank you for coming, and please, I'll turn it over to Mrs. Shim Jae-ok.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
It is my sincerest pleasure to welcome you to our third Fulbright Forum of the 2010 program year. Before we begin, I would like to thank the U.S. Embassy and Information Resource Center staff for co-hosting tonight's lecture. The use of their facility has allowed us to offer our forum presentation to an even wider audience and brings the research of Fulbright American students and senior scholars to the fore of academic, social, and cultural discussions. Tonight, I find myself awaiting our forum presentation with added anticipation. Just 2 days ago, U.S. President Barack Obama delivered his State of the Union address, a speech that centered on unemployment, bipartisanship, war, and foreign policy. He also touched upon international education. However, specifically citing South Korea as a place where teachers are known as nation builders. The world has taken notice of the educational miracle in this country, and yet many of the social and economic issues that accompany the reality often go unmentioned. Not tonight. This evening, we are joined by 2010 senior scholar Alison Chandler, as she delivers her own State of the Union address about South Korea and its impact on global education trend. As a graduate from UC Berkeley School of Journalism and former Coral Fellow in Public Affairs in San Francisco, she currently works for Washington Post and frequently contributes educational-related articles to such publications as Santa Barbara News Press, the Salt Lake Tribune, and National Public Radio. Mrs. Chandler's research and forum presentation entitled Reforming One of the World's Best Performing School Systems is both imperative and timely. I hope that we can walk away tonight with a better understanding of the complex issues that currently face South Korea's educational system and those countries who seek to use its success as a model for their own education reform. Following tonight's presentation and a brief Q&A session, I hope that you will join us for a light reception catered by the deli at Dragon Hill Lodge as we continue our discussion on this important topic. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming 2010 senior scholar Alison Chandler.
Well, thank you all for coming. And I first want to thank Fulbright. This has been such an amazing, rewarding experience, and I'm deeply grateful. So thank you, Mrs. Shim, and all the really great people who work for Fulbright, and thanks to the Embassy and to the ROK for making it possible. I am giving this presentation about one of the world's best performing school systems, Korea. Many education reformers, as Mrs. Shim mentioned, in the US especially, are looking at South Korea as an example of success. South Korea is known for its hunger for education and for instilling very high skills in its students. In the US, we are struggling with very high dropout rates in high schools. And we also, on a deeper level, struggle with academic apathy and as well as low skills. When students come into the community college system or the college system in general, a lot of them come with like elementary level math and reading skills, and this is a big challenge right now. With the rise of international rankings and also the Asian economies, there's become this big interest in what is happening in schools like this one. This happens to be a science high school for budding geniuses in Gyeonggi province. And so I decided to apply for this grant to come to South Korea. I more personally was interested because I was covering education in the Washington, D.C. suburbs, and there's a big Korean immigrant community in Northern Virginia. So I was seeing a lot of Korean families who were doing unusual things like splitting up, and the dad would stay in Seoul and make money, and they would, have a marriage on different countries, from different countries for years at a time, so kids could get into American colleges essentially later on. The Kirogi phenomenon, wild geese families. Also kids who were sent alone from a very young age to go to private schools or live with host families. So I wanted to see what was going on here. As we've already known and was reaffirmed this year, the Koreans did very well on most recent international tests. This is the 2009 results, which were released in the fall. Mrs. Shim says the 2010 are already out, and Korea even improved on these scores. But for 2009, they were first in reading comprehension, third in math, fifth in science. One caveat is that mainland China has not participated traditionally, and they did, and Shanghai participated as a province this year, and they bested all of these scores. But Korea as a nation did better than everyone else. In parentheses, that's where the US is coming in these scores. Korea's education story is all the more compelling because its development came so quickly. Following Japanese occupation in World War II, the economy was in ruins, and there was a nearly 80% illiteracy rate. That has dropped like a stone. It's less than 2%, one of the best in the world. And that's due to the cultural belief in education as the main path of success, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, we've heard again and again. It's also due to the government being very ambitious about its education policy. It built schools fast, it packed people into them. There were class sizes of like 80. It had school in shifts, a morning shift and a night shift. And they set a series of policies for compulsory education. So everyone went to elementary school, and then it was compulsory for everyone to go to middle school. Then everyone went to high school, and now that has put all this pressure on the college system. So this next chart shows how the percent of, these are age groups. So for 55 to 64-year-olds, less than 15% have an actual degree. But less than 2 generations later, it's 56%. So that's, again, the highest among the OECD countries, the developed nations. In the US, as you can see, the growth in that sort of time span has been much lower. And I've heard that it's actually maybe turning around for the next generation, maybe dropping slightly. So these are the kinds of statistics that policymakers talk about when they worry about competition and where the jobs are going to go in the future. So as we've heard, Obama loves South Korean schools. Obama. This is supposed to be a heart. And he did mention them in the State of the Union most recently when he talked about nation builders. Teachers are nation builders, and thought that could be a lesson to how we should respect our teachers in the U.S. But he most frequently refers to this lunch that he had with Lee Myung-bak early in his presidency, where he asked the Korean president, "What is your biggest challenge educationally?" And Lee Myung-bak said, "Oh, the biggest problem is these parents they're so demanding, they're very ambitious, they want better schools for their kids, and he can't meet their demands. And so in America, we think that's like hilarious, that could be a problem, because that would be a welcome problem, is what policymakers say. So when you come to Korea, as many of you have seen, people are bewildered by the praise. And this is just one example. This is a middle schooler that I talked to, and she says, I think President Obama may be misunderstanding the situation. And she, like every kid that I've met, has a double school day. She goes to public school until 4 o'clock, and then she goes to either Hagwons or stays at her school until late at night. And so there's all this pressure now. It's become a very competitive system. People have very similar aspirations to go to college and then to go to the best colleges. And that has led to some of the nation's most serious social problems. The suicide rate, the plummeting birth rate, and then this brain drain. If parents can afford it, they send their kids abroad where they can escape the pressure and have another opportunity to achieve. One of the things that I looked at most closely in my research was the achievement gap. In the US, we're a much more racially, ethnically diverse country. We talk about the achievement gap in racial terms often. In Korea, it's becoming a larger conversation around class. Korea is proud of its dragon from a ditch tradition. So people coming from humble beginnings and achieving greatness in the last 60 years. That's been an opportunity many people have had through the education system, but it's becoming very difficult to do if you don't have money. And that is because of the huge explosion in private tutoring. Korea has, after a little research I confirmed it, the largest cram school private tutoring industry in the world. And that's measured by participation. 3/4 of all students see a private tutor or go to a cram school outside of the regular school day. Okay, this graph is a little confusing, but it shows growth over time, and then it's broken down who goes, so elementary, middle, and high school. And elementary, it's the most, and that makes sense. A lot of these schools probably double as daycare for families. And then they do different things at different age levels. In elementary, it's like taekwondo and English kindergarten. And middle school, maybe some math acceleration and English conversation classes. And in high school, it's largely the test prep. How much is this costing? Some recent numbers. To put it in context, $32.5 billion was spent on public education in 2009. And then families invested an additional $19 billion in private tutoring and lessons in cram schools. So this is a huge force in the education system here. Oh, by the way, that breaks down to about $210 per month per kid for family. But some families spend way more, especially in Seoul. I was talking to a mother recently who told me the going rate for English tutors is 50,000 won per hour for a native speaker. But she said, for me, I'm a blonde American, blondish, blonde enough, I guess. It would be more like 60,000. And that if you have an Ivy League degree, you could probably easily command that much. But she ended up paying a 500,000 won reference fee to find a tutor who had those kind of credentials. I also talked to a kid recently who's paying $1,600 a month for a math tutor twice weekly. From Taechidong, so he's like from the the hottest cram school neighborhood, so he can command this higher fee. So the price tag is unlimited. And what I think is the most interesting thing once you look at this all on the table is that I don't think that outside of Korea, this huge part of the education system is really acknowledged. I think when you look at the success of Korean schools, really the government takes most of the accolades. I think people think it's something that the government is doing, maybe exclusively. And so education policy experts, for example, will talk about Korea's teacher quality. And indeed, it's very competitive to become a public school teacher here. And so their skill levels are much higher than average skill levels of teachers in the US. There are strong national standards, and that's something we don't have in the US, where it's different depending on what state or sometimes even locality you're in. So the lowest bar is higher in Korea. You know, they do have the longer school day and the parental involvement. But clearly, a lot of learning is happening outside the classroom. And secondly, I think the effectiveness of the public schools that are so lauded has really been compromised and imperiled in a way that I didn't expect to see. And that has to do with this huge investment of money and time and energy that's going into the private academies. So what do I mean by that? This is a sentiment you'll hear often. School is becoming a place where you pass the time. It's a place you go until you can and hang out with your friends and visit or sleep until you can go to a hagwon, and that's where you kind of get up to speed and you where most of your concentration is. And so that, you know, for obvious reasons, public schools are at a competitive disadvantage right now. As a sort of legacy of this rapid growth, classrooms still have maybe not 80 students or 60 students, but 40 students isn't uncommon. And they have this strong national curriculum, which means that that's standardized, which means that all 10th graders are really learning what other 10th graders are learning. So it may be that they're starting to do some ability grouping, especially in English, but they'll put the better English speakers in a different room, but they're still using the same curriculum and expected to go through the same material. So at a hagwon, you can it's one-on-one. It's completely customized to what you want, what you need, what your goals are. So it's very hard to compete with that. And I would argue actually that public schools have kind of been complicit in this. I've heard lots of stories of public school teachers, you know, they don't assign homework because it's, you know, students are just going to go to hagwon, so they don't have time to do it. Or the hagwons will assign homework, so they know that they don't have time for it. And also, I think the public schools, you know, especially in wealthier areas where the hagwon participation is so high, they don't really offer any alternative right now for kids. It's kind of a ghost town in many schools after the last bell rings. When you talk to academy owners, and this is one quote from the chairman of Pagoda, which is like, you've seen their high-rises, they're a very big national chain, and actually they work mostly with adults in English. They do a lot of test prep for like TOEFL and different English proficiency tests. And so he says, through the attempts to regulate the private industry, the government is making everyone settle for lower quality, and Korean parents do not want, he called it a same chair, same chalkboard approach to education for their kids. So he argues that it's very unwise to regulate hagwons, I'm sorry, because the quality is not there, and it's not right now. This school, he also talked about how parents now, because Korea has become so affluent, they're accustomed to a level of luxury that they expect to see in their home. They expect to see it in the kinds of you know, toys they buy for their kids and the cars that they drive. Why would they settle for anything less when it comes to the education of their kids? And they hire like an interior decorator to kind of lavishly decorate the classrooms, and everyone is different. And that's sort of the philosophy behind that, is that people want they want to be in a much more luxurious surroundings that reflects their, you know, their home life. And so clearly, the private industry has offered a level of specialization that public schools have not been able to at this point. And they have helped drive Korea to top rankings in recent years. And this has come at a huge social and personal cost in South Korea, and that's where all the challenges are happening right now. Through the intense pressure, their kids have very little time to explore anything outside of their double-stacked school day. There's immense financial pressure on families. Families with the most money have a great advantage, and even middle-class families are really squeezed. Right now, it's not an option to go to private schools if you can't afford to opt out if you want to compete at a higher level. So if you do, you fall out of the race. And I think that in a different way, what's happening is as parents have voted with their feet. So as they have invested their money and their kids' time in a hagwon, it sort of is changed what people expect of the public schools. And I think if they only go outside to seek specialization, then it kind of says we don't expect that from the regular school day. We don't expect enrichment, we don't expect remediation, we don't expect to get a competitive education from the public school. People have kind of given up on that, I think. So for years, the government's been trying to change this dynamic and to wrest control back from the private sector. And the latest attempt, the most famous attempt was an outright ban, which was famously a failure. In the 1980s, there was under the military dictatorship, there was just like, it was illegal to go to any kind of hagwon. And so everything was underground, and there were like secret tutors, and college students would like dress in like high school uniforms and pretend they're going to see their friends and give them secret lessons. So it's funny all the illicit studying that happens in this country. The latest attempt is kind of in this vein, which is that at least in Seoul, there's a crackdown, an immediate crackdown on the private sector. With some new tuition limits, the curfew is 10 o'clock, and I visited sort of a nerve center in the Ministry of Education headquarters where there's some bureaucrats there, and their job day in and day out is to monitor this kind of hotline and this watchdog website where like moonlighting ajumas, phone in or send in their tips about the illegally operating hagwons, and they have to take photos of the receipts that they get, or take pictures of like the blankets tacked to windows of at 11 o'clock. So anyway, they can get paid if the investigators can confirm it, but we don't know if how many investigators they have on the ground, and a lot of people think this is a very hard thing to police, and a lot of the provinces in Korea haven't even tried to do it, but Seoul right now has some of these limitations in effect. The government is also trying to get more competitive with the private industry, and they're doing this in many ways, and I'll go through some of them. One is very similar to things that we're seeing in the US. They are implementing, they started, I think a few years ago, a kind of no child left behind like testing system, which is supposed to kind of pit school against school and publish all the scores and get them sort of working harder. And also a new teacher evaluation system that's rolling out now. And the idea behind that is that teachers, while it's very competitive to get in, teachers kind of coast when they get there because they have job security and they can last, they don't have to work as hard once they get there. So this will put some more accountability into the system in that way. In English has been a big kind of tension point because a third actually of the money in tutoring goes into English education right now. The ministry has recruited about 8,500 native speakers, and now they have somebody working in about 3/4 of the schools around the country. And I guess Fulbright is working on this too with their rural outreach teaching program. And they also do telecasting. That's what this is. This is a woman who's in Manila, and she's talking to some kids in a school in the mountains in central South Korea. There they are at the bottom. And they also moved, they started introducing English earlier at 3rd grade, and then they have this Teaching English and English initiative. I'm not sure if you've heard of this, but as Hagwons have had native speakers in the classroom for a long time, but it's been slower in public schools, and a lot of the English teachers trained in Korea mostly learned by reading and through test taking and know grammar very well, but had a hard time talking with the kids. So that's like a lot of teachers are being retrained so that they can themselves become more proficient in English speaking. Have you guys heard of English villages? Raise your hand. Okay. This is a Gyeonggi English village. And you can see the Stonehenge on top, or Stonehenge that's out in front. It gives it sort of like a theme park vibe. And actually, one of the times I visited, there were all these like tourists from Thailand there. So it's become sort of like a stop on the tourist track. But I think this is the biggest English village. And what it does is this is a way to compete with the study abroad industry. So if you don't have money to go to English camp over winter or to like spend your 7th grade year in the US or whatever, you can go to English Village. And once you get inside, there's like a mock town with like cobblestone streets, and you can like bump into the bank teller or the general store and practice your spoken English, as well as take classes. This is a very expensive approach, and it seems to fall in sort of the trendy category. I don't know, I think some have already closed in other provinces. This one is really, there's a lot of money behind it, and they're really trying to make it work. Okay, EBS. Public television here, unsurprisingly, is like huge. There's not one channel, there's 6. There's a radio station. One of the television stations is full-time English instruction, and one is for around-the-clock test preparation. I know you want to watch that station. This guy is Michelle Rhee's brother. His name's Brian Rhee. Michelle Rhee is a Korean-American woman who is the chancellor of the DC Public, oh, I'm sorry, she is not anymore. She's the head of a national reform nonprofit, and she's trying to motivate all of these big reforms in the US. And her brother is a guy who is like a lot of people that we know here. He came here, you know, he wanted to get into the film industry and learn Korean and hang out in Seoul a few years. And he pretty quickly, you know, as an English speaker, got a job as teaching English, and then he started working for EBS. And he works for a show called Drama English, and he breaks down little snippets of Korean dramas and teaches the English, translates them into English, and then sends, you know, this show is targeted toward middle school age children who live in rural areas or poor neighborhoods and don't have access to Hagwon. This is a really interesting school that I visited in, and it's where they were doing the Filipino telecommunicating English classes. These kids go to a school there's only 13 kids there. It's in one of these agricultural areas that have just like been virtually abandoned as Korea's industrialized and urbanized. I think at its height it had like 130 students, but now basically every student has her own classroom. And this is the first grade class. So this is full-time job is to teach these kids. So essentially, this is a public school, but it's like they're getting full-time tutoring. And this, like, I was so astonished when I saw that this school was still open. Korea has consolidated a lot of their schools because thousands of schools were abandoned like this. But there are a number that have stayed open, and I think it's very true that the country does invest a lot of resources in its poor neighborhoods. They had flat screen TVs in every classroom. Literally, once I counted up the staff, it was like a 1-to-1 kind of ratio. I mean, there's no kind of economic argument really that makes sense here. But clearly these kids were getting a kind of a gold standard education in the mountains of Korea. And they go home at 5 o'clock. This could not happen in the U.S. Because of our tax structure. Poor schools do get extra money from the federal government, but most funding comes from localities. So this was very surprising to me. Okay, this is the biggest part of the reform effort right now. Have you guys heard about SPEC or Ipak Sajangwan or the new college admission system? Just nod, okay. This is sort of like the buzz, everything, what's changing right now. And I think that the ministry really sees this as like the change that will affect all other changes. The traditional system in Korea and many East Asian and former Soviet and other countries is a test system to get into college. You pass the test, you know, the higher score, the better the college. And it's been tweaked a lot over time. Occasionally there's an essay required, or you have to get the high GPA. But that's it, and that's fueled this whole Chesu Hagwon industry. And this is Chesu Hagwon in my neighborhood. And these 4 nice young men spent their entire last year, 6.5 days a week till 11 o'clock at night, doing practice tests. Which I think is the counterpoint to the gap year in the US, where you get to like travel through Europe or volunteer with kids in Africa. This is sort of like the parallel time of your life and what you do before you go to college. So this is, I guess it's traditionally, the testing system has been seen as a very meritocratic system. Because anyone, if they study hard enough, if you can pass this test, it's sort of the fairest way to see, to let the hardest workers or the most intelligent, the people who know the most, to get to the top. But in light of all of the private tutoring, it's become very hard, and it became a big political issue as the top colleges started counting up all of the portion of their schools that were coming from like 3 neighborhoods in Gangnam, and it was getting to be a bigger and bigger share of the pool every year. So equity is a big motivation for changing the college admission system. There's another motivation equally important, and I talked with the Minister of Education, Lee Ju-ho. He said, Korean parents are very ambitious, they want a lot of education for their children, but that energy has been spent on raising test scores and not on nurturing creativity or any other aspect of human nature. Through the new system, and this is a picture, by the way, of right on the Chesu Hagwon of all of the kids, supposedly that year, who got into Seoul National by retaking the test. So that's old system. So basically, this is the first thing that is supposed to change. What will the new system look like? It's basically an American adapted system where the government is actually paying for it. They're paying for admissions officers, and they're training them, and the admissions officers are going to look for other things, not just test score, but talent, potential, all of these other kinds of things, hobbies, or demonstrated interest in unique, quirky things. So it's a polar opposite kind of system. It's an enormous undertaking. It's very new. So I did some research into how it's working so far. 10% of this year's freshman students that will start in March were selected through this system. So here is one of the lucky winners of that system. His name is Yu Hwa-young. It's kind of a weird photo. It was taken at Everland on the day of the national college exam, which he got to skip because he was already in, and he had been selected through the admissions officer system. He got into Sogang International Studies program. Sogang's like a nice college up high in the rankings. And he is, let's see, he had a near perfect TOEFL score. He studied abroad throughout all of his middle school years. His English is beautiful. He did have a lot of extracurriculars. He did Model UN competitions. He did debate. And from almost all of these, he had to go outside of his public high school because there really is very little to offer him. There was a school newspaper that he wrote for, but I think it came out maybe twice. I think he said he spent maybe 6 hours on it the whole year. So in order to kind of fill out his well-roundedness, he really had to look outside of his public school. On the other hand, Hagwons have adapted really quickly to this system. And so he found a Hagwon for kids like him who were applying to this exact kind of program. And it was very helpful, he said. They assigned books there, like from authors like Noam Chomsky. He read Thomas Friedman. And he did practice interviews at the Hagwon, like he would be, to prepare for the interview he would have when he went to Sogang. And he also had a tutor who, for his TOEFL, like in the months before his TOEFL test, and his tutor also told him, I think he said that his tutor had parents who knew Kofi Annan, and he said that Kofi Annan wrote him a letter of recommendation. I could not verify that, but this is one of the connections that he said he had. So, this is supposed to be a more fair system, and it's supposed to reduce the reliance on private tutoring. In this case, it definitely doesn't appear to have done that. So, that's where things are. This is another girl who is sort of the poster child of who, in theory, this system is supposed to work for. And we don't know yet, I have to say, because she's applying next year. Her dream is to go to Iwa Women's University. And she comes from Gumi. If you haven't been in Gumi, it's like an industrial city. A lot of factories are there. Her mom works in a factory. They're middle class, they're comfortable, but she couldn't afford to study abroad. She wanted to. Instead, her parents invited one of the exchange teachers who came from the US to live at their house, so she got to learn a lot that way. And she has an advisor at her high school who learned about the new college admission system and is trying to help her become the well-rounded applicant that these admissions officers will like. So she's been preparing, not spending all her time studying for the college test, but doing some other things. She writes little plays and poems. She and enters them into contests, of course. What does she do? She translates English books into Korean. She has a blog about English grammar. She stays at school till 11 o'clock. I mean, she's trying to do everything. And this is her in a nursing home. So she started volunteering is also like a boom industry now. The colleges want to see it on the applications. So it's still too soon to say, but she is trying these other ways. And one potential advantage is with this system, you don't have to be good at everything. She thinks her strength is in English, it's in liberal arts, and she's putting all her energy there. She's not trying to also be a perfect math student. I mean, she's really trying, and if this works, that could be a potential benefit, that you can at least focus on what your passion is. So the new goal for this system is to be a self-starter, a self-studier. And the Hagwon, a big criticism of the Hagwon is it just kind of sends you, your hand is held like through your whole education. And you go from Hagwon to Hagwon. People coach you constantly. I have a science teacher friend who told me that one of her students, or several of her students, it's common, they take all her handouts that she gives them and her lectures, and they go to their science Hagwon, and then the Hagwon prepares a study guide for them, doing some extra research in addition to the points that she gave them. So they come back to class with their study guide, and to kind of, so they're coached in their studying for the midterm. And so she's always trying to outsmart them and like put a surprise question in there that she didn't ever put on the handout, or it's this whole game and tug of war. But so the admissions officers are really trained to look for this. I did this myself. I was interested in this and I did it. I found a way to do it, and I didn't have to go. I wasn't coached. So this is a buzzword. And one of the kind of weird and sad side effects of that is every student that I talked to told me that this was all they do. Like this is, they believe in that it's so important to study for themselves, and they would tell me, if they're speaking perfect English to me and they're like, I have never been to English Hagwon, and of course it's like impossible. And this is a new system, and I think it's kind of, it's a rule changer, it's a game changer, but that's sort of like what how kids are supposed to present themselves, which, it presented challenges for me as a reporter, because I was getting spun by these like 12-year-old kids, were lied to. And also it presents a challenge for these admissions officers who also have to figure out, where are they coming from? And also not to villainize the Hagwon, where this is the system that these kids grew up in. The question is, what did you do with what opportunities that you had? And, it's very difficult to undo or to untangle or to, have students be able to learn on their own, but take advantage of Hagwon if it helps them in some ways. So I guess basically, I think that the goal is not to have a system that's completely without private tutoring. I mean, it's unrealistic, and I don't think it's desirable. But I think the danger is in having a system where you're trapped, where there's no opportunity to succeed unless you go through that system and you spend, so much money and time in that system. And for that reason, I think that this admissions officer system has great potential, like as it develops and matures, and if it gains, credibility, because what it's essentially doing is it's reinvesting in the public schools, and it's saying we want, as it says to students, we want to see what you did at your high school. We want to see what activities you took advantage of. Well, that also sends a message to high schools of like, oh, we have to provide some, you know, and so there's sort of a new demand to reinvest there. And same thing with teachers. There's all these surveys now that say that kids trust their Hagwon teacher more than they trust their public school teacher, or they say that if I could only invite one to my wedding, who would I invite? It's Hagwon teacher, you know. So, but I think, you know, as colleges want to see recommendations, like this is a new thing, a teacher recommendation from a public school teacher. That's kind of implies that the teachers need to cultivate a relationship with the student, and the students need to cultivate those mentors and to try and build a relationship that could lead to a recommendation. I mean, it just builds a much more, a lot more investment it's raising the standards again for the public schools of what you will expect from them. And so globally right now, private tutoring is growing, and for a number of reasons. Education is growing. It's no longer for some people and not for everybody. It's a knowledge economy. So as more and more people seek education, there's just naturally going to be more private tutoring. There's also a lot more, you know, now that everyone's on the same yardstick with international rankings, with high stakes tests, you know, tests that you have to pass even to graduate from high school, you know, all these tests that compare schools to schools. All of these things create competition, create pressure, create a demand for extra help. So this is growing. In the U.S., just as a comparison, the best estimate I got for the size of private tutoring right now is about 5 to 7 billion. And it's a large part is test prep. Well, actually, I think it's only maybe $1 billion to 2 is test prep for SAT, and actually, the Washington Post is a big funder of these programs, or a provider through Kaplan. But they also have No Child Left Behind is actually funding a huge boom in private tutoring, because for all the consistently low performing schools, they require that those schools offer some kind of outside privately offered tutoring. So that's been a huge boost to the industry there. Industry in India, it's estimated at 40 billion a year. And so, as this happens, I think Korea is an interesting country to watch. I think it's an extreme. It is an extreme. But I think the lesson is in how sort of the private tutoring can just change what people expect from their public schools. And I don't think that you have to go. I think if parents expect more from their public schools, they will get more from their public schools if they demand it. And the Korean parents certainly have the energy to do that. I worked in a really high-performing school, as a reporter in a really high-performing school system outside of Washington. And parents constantly, I think if you ask the superintendent there, what's your biggest problem in education, he would say the parents. But they really expect that the public schools will deliver whatever it is that they want, whether it's like the best robotics program in the world, or whether it's a specialized program for the most recent immigrant group from like Laos. You know, it's very much they have a very high expectation for the public system. That's not the norm, but I'm just saying I've seen it happen, and it is possible. And this is my blog. Please follow me and check out more information about what I've learned in Korean schools. So I'm happy to take your questions. Go ahead.
I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but did you find anything talking to students that, I think a lot of us here are teachers in middle, elementary, high schools. I'm a high school conversation English teacher, and I would think that in a culture that so encourages cultural homogeny, I mean, like, they all listen to the same songs. Thank you. And they memorize the same songs and they wear the same clothes. It's very much like you do what's popular. And it's very different from what I saw in the US, which was like in high school, you want to be the different, unique individual that's different from all the other, 1,850 kids at your high school. So it seems like in that culture, it would be very difficult to build this like self-taught, I have individual pursuits, attitude that these admission counselors or interviewers are looking for. Did you run into anybody talking about anything like that, or?
No, and obviously this is going to be, it's going to be its own system, whatever it is, because I look at this image and this is sort of a big part of the model. It's like self-study. Well, what's self-study? Sitting alone in a room and just like studying? That's so boring. But I think they have to do that still. One of the biggest problems is to be competitive, they still have to have the academics. And to be academically competitive, it just takes a huge amount of work. So, first, you're going to have to get over that hurdle. But secondly, have you also met a lot of really teenagers who have studied abroad or who have had some exposure to a different system or have yearned to, who really have a ton of curiosity and fascination about different things and really feel stuck because they don't have time to do it, or at least not now. They feel like I have to do this until I can do this. I don't believe that kids don't have, I think culturally, you're right, it's a huge challenge. But it's a mold changer. I wish I knew the answer to that, but yeah, it's going to be a big challenge.
Michael, looking at the education system as you have for the last few months, you've seen, obviously that the Korean parents, especially the Ajima, is the emotional engine that drives this country.
Yeah.
And she is a steely-eyed, demanding taskmaster. And so for one point she's driving her child because she wants the best for her child. She wants the top school, she wants the best grades to get into the top school because top schools bring the best job and brings the best money and therefore brings happiness. But on the other hand, anyone who's lived here, you see these poor kids and they don't have childhoods and because they don't have any type of extracurricular activity. In your opinion, is the Ajima kid's worst nightmare, worst enemy, or is is she the child's best friend, or somewhere in between?
So you want to talk about Tiger Mother? Both, yeah. Well, having a parent advocate is like an ace in the hole, right? It's the biggest thing that you want to have. It's the biggest indicator of whether you will succeed in school or not. Does your parent believe in you and in education and push you? The prescriptive way that it happens here, I think it's dangerous. I think that it's not healthy for the moms either. I think I saw it most in these conversations, these uncomfortable conversations that I had with kids where I'm asking them, how did you learn English? And they're looking at their moms nervously because they don't want to tell the truth, which is that they went to a hagwon because everybody does it. But, the mom is coached them, this is our opportunity, to, get your name out there, or maybe as somebody who's a self-starter, where I think it's instilling sometimes the value of competitiveness over the value of being a human being or so I think it's a very troubling relationship.
One follow-up question,
Yeah.
is the perfect school system somewhere between underachieving, scofflaw American school system and this hyper on track Korean system?
Yes.
Somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I think that's what everyone's doing. I think that in the East, everyone's looking at the West, how can we be creative and free thinking and get a Nobel Prize? And in the West, I think actually not even all policymakers say they want to, but they never would have wanted to go to an education system like this. But they believe that kids should study more math and study harder and spend more time at this desk. And I actually believe that. Tina.
I guess I'm gonna go ahead and ask my follow-up question, but with the education reform that they're trying to do now, from talking with the kids, are they finding that they're having to do even more than just being creative, than just being, self-discovering? Because they have to fulfill that criteria, but if they fail to get admission before the national entrance, they still have to do the national entrance.
Yeah. Oh, this is the biggest problem.
Right.
Yeah, they have to do double.
Right, and just, I guess following up on one of your points, you say that people who can afford it, the husband will remain here in Seoul or just anywhere in Korea, whereas the mother will take their kid or children to the States. Spend the money so that they can enjoy the freedom and the education system in the States. Does that mean that fundamentally they believe that the best education is in the States and not necessarily best performing, but what's best for the kids? Because that's kind of what I went through as well. So I'm just saying, like, what is best performing? How do you define that? And what do they really believe in?
Well, I think that the parents that I talk to who want to send their kids to the States, there's two reasons. One is that maybe they studied abroad themselves and they really believe it's a much better school system and it's a much more enriching school system and they'll come out smarter in many different ways. But it also has the tangible advantage of they can come back here and it has prestige and they can go far with it and they can be bilingual. So it has both practical and sort of, intellectual advantages. The second group of parents, though, is the kids aren't doing well here, and so the parents don't think that he will be able to get into a good college, and so it's another avenue to come back and get that same tangible benefit. I think they're reluctant. They're less excited about the cost and the separation, but it's another way to get the sort of material benefit of that experience and degree. Sorry, I don't know who. Go ahead in the back.
I have a comment / question, I guess. So I've actually taught at a hagwon that stays open until 1 a.m. For a very short time, and at one of the teacher at one point told me that he had gotten the college entrance questions through a friend of his, and he was a very, very successful teacher. He was making tons of money. He was very, very in demand. And he said one of the reasons why was because he was able to get stuff like this. And it was known from all the parents in that hagwon that he had those questions, and that's why they came to that hagwon and paid premium, premium hagwon fees.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a big problem, and I'm sure you've heard a little bit about the cheating and, things like mothers drawing their elementary school kids pictures for them so that they can win art competitions in elementary school. There's really, however much of it is myth or reality is unclear, but it happens. A lot of stuff like that happens, and when I hear these stories and when I look at the education system, I'm wondering what is the definition of success in this kind of situation? You have this crazy kind of competition to get to college, and actually, for me, it looks like it's like competition for the sake of competition. This is for me the limits. What I see as the limits of you have a population that is very, very qualified, but they can't all get into those top 3 schools. There's just not enough room. So the tests get harder and harder and harder, and they just don't know what to do with them. I've seen some crazy tests where they're actually trying to trick people to get the wrong answer because they just don't have, they can't give everyone hundreds on the test. And so I'm just kind of wondering what you think about this, this whole system and what the limits are. That's why they're going to the U.S. where people aren't, maybe as crazy or qualified as they are, and they can actually maybe survive and do well. So I'm just kind of curious what you think about this whole thing in those terms. And then I'm also curious about kind of a smaller, and I don't know how big of a problem it is, but the people on the margins who are not in this crazy competition to get to those 3 schools. And I'm talking about the kind of growing number of what they call multiculturals, and North Korean defectors and people with disabilities. And, you know, what's the story for them if you've done any research in terms of where they're going to be or what school looks like for them?
Yeah, so the sneakiness is what a lot of people are willing to pay for, right? You hear, I mean, the Hagwon teachers that get paid a lot, there have been like busts where the teacher had, I don't know, gets the test ahead of time, or what did they get the interview? I mean, that's a big part, I guess, of the gaming that happens. And yeah, it's, I mean, I guess I hinted at that with these kids lying to me for spinning, you know, trying to spin their situation. It's intellectual honesty. I mean, it's a big question, and I think through this admission officer system, it's going to really force that question, because that's going to be their jobs. It's trying to figure out what's real. The best one I heard recently was that parents, if a kid, so it looks very good now to have, I need a test if you're like president of your class or something. And so Hagwon owner, Matthew, sorry, Lillian, his assistant is here, is telling me that kids, if they get elected, it's like never their own campaigning. The parents like throw a party at their house and have all the kids in the class over, and like, so I mean, you hear these stories again and again, and yeah, I think it's a hugely troubling part of the system. The second question that you had, about kids on the margins, I think in that small school that I went to, it was in a province that has one of the highest rates of migrant families coming from South Asia to work on the farms, and from China. And one of the kids, two brothers of the 13, have a Thai mom. And so in some pockets, I think, and in that place, there were a lot of programs that were targeted at helping them. They were born in Korea. Their mom didn't speak fluent Korean, but they had some kind of tutor from the local college who was going to her house and helping her. So I have seen efforts to integrate those kids and get them up to speed academically. I know there's programs that, I know one of the Fulbright Fellows works in one, that for North Korean defectors, and those kids who come with huge educational gaps, many of them, if they left North Korea and maybe lived in China for many years before they came, and maybe worked and go to school. The language is different by the time they get here, you know, even if they've been in school the whole time. But to teach them English, and there's these kind of affirmative action programs in the colleges, including like Seoul Day and Korea, to try and get a few of them in every year and help them to be successful. I don't know a ton about it, just examples. Same with, there's starting to be some programs for students that have disabilities. I don't know the extent of them, but I've seen those kind of lists also at the top universities. They have kind of a quota of students that they want to try and bring in, and they look for them. So there's some ways to address that. In the back? Is it?
Yeah. I have two questions. One of them, I thought it was interesting the way you described the school in the mountains, about how they were getting a gold standard education.
Mm-hmm.
And like the one-on-one ratio and basically the ratio between the teachers and the students and how small that is, it almost seems like a very American sort of definition of what educational quality is. And I guess my first question is, how would you in a way define Korean definition of educational quality, and how that might be changing? And my second question is, I've heard that there's a movement towards true education. It's called, I don't know.
I haven't heard of it.
But 참교육, and I was just wondering, like, if you've like heard or done any research with that regard, and how that might be faring against the standard educational system that's in place.
Has anyone heard of this? Can someone help out? True education, or what's the Korean term for it?
참교육.
Chamgoyu?
I'm not sure if it's the exact same thing, but I know a lot of people, my students and the teachers at my school tell me that they're really starting to want to push away from the rote memorization and really get into discussing and higher thinking, because all they're doing is memorizing facts and spitting them out, and they're wanting to get away from that, and that's a big movement right now. That's what they're telling me in my school.
You're referring to the alternative school?
Yeah,
There's some, the schools outside the public school system,
Uh-huh,
and it's called alternative schools.
uh-huh,
And they actually, their goal is to educate the children, so-called chango, the true education.
uh-huh.
But it's not actually the official education. And they have to take another test
Mm-hmm.
to enter the college.
Oh, there is another test for them to take though?
But because
Yeah.
their degree in high school is not officially approved by the university.
Uh-huh.
Well, in my understanding, the 참교육, which is can be translated into English true education, is more focused. They are more focused on the whole person education, and it's mainly driven by the teachers' union, who are more radical,
Oh, okay.
which is not so friendly with the government.
Oh.
So the idea is very idealistic
Uh-huh.
because instead of sending private tutoring, instead of forcing the kids to memorize whole thing like that,
Yeah.
their idea is that to raise and educate the kids as a whole person.
I think with a different college admission system, as it develops, it would have room for kids to go to a different kind of school like that. I mean, in the past, if you couldn't do well on that test, which if you're not training for it specifically, it's very hard to do, then there's no room for that. So I would say that the goal of good education has been to teach as much as you can, as many things and facts and notable things as you can, rather than putting the pieces together and what do you think of that and why is that important and why do we care. This guy's in the middle with the glasses.
Can I have mic, please?
Yeah.
Just out of respect for your research, I'd like to stand.
Oh,
My name is An Se-min. I am a host of a show on EBS. You mentioned EBS. A friend of mine, Casey, invited me to this event. Thank you. I came here for three purposes. One, to ask you a question about what you think your research findings here will, how much light it can shed for its possible transplantation for the U.S. system. And I found your statement here, reforming one of the world's best performing, and we talked about the definition of that. And I thought maybe you were being cynical. I wasn't sure. I wanted to also get you because the U.S. I am one of those people who spent half my life here and half my life in the U.S. Been exposed to various parts of the public and the private education systems. So this was very interesting, and I wanted to get your comment on that because I'm interested in how this will pan out in the United States.
Well, I think this, in terms of lessons for reform, I think it just goes back to the diligence question. If you care about, especially improving math skills in the U.S., and that's just a lesson that comes from just believing that that's one way to succeed is by working hard at it and practicing. And this is sort of evidence that it works. But I think in terms of the reform approaches, there's already a lot of conversations. It's interesting, I went to a education reform conference in Bahrain in the Gulf region, and there were people from all over the world. And it was creepy a little bit because everyone was talking about No Child Left Behind. And it's like this thing that in the US we're so, it feels like this virus that, that I think has some merit and has made some improvements. But I want to do more research, but I also think it's had a lot of unintended consequences. So I was really interested that Korea was interested in No Child Left Behind because it's already a very testing heavy society, and I think No Child Left Behind has done the best work in the places that were kind of not forgotten in the US, where everyone knew that the schools were terrible and these poor neighborhoods and urban ghettos or whatever in Detroit, but now we really know because we can see it, and I think it's done a lot for the worst performing schools and the lowest, the places that are forgotten. But I think that I have not seen that the disparities in Korea have ever been that great in the past 20 years. So I have been really surprised that they would want to put another really testing heavy system on a test oriented system already. It seems really onerous to me. But I think also the national standards are often lauded here from Korea and are something that there's already a huge movement in the U.S. to try and to get a more agreement upon what's the baseline for what kids should be taught in schools. The teacher qualifications for teachers, I think the policymakers have been studying the system here for a while in terms of trying to replicate some of those things. Go ahead. Sorry.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I was wondering if you've done any research on private schools and whether expectations of private schools had kind of changed as a result of higher attendance at Hagwons, and or whether this was a place where kind of already rich students are going and kind of supplementing that private education with Hagwon also, or whether that kind of is a more balanced form of education where they're maybe not expected to attend Hagwon after school. And what you have found about that.
I haven't looked a lot at private schools. In the U.S. we have this whole private-public thing going on, but it's if you opt out, you go to private school, you go to Catholic school, you don't go to public school. Here, there's less of that. I don't know the numbers, but there's just not as much. People seem to go, more people go to the public school, which it's kind of confusing because a lot of them are actually private run, but they're governmentally funded and managed, or the regulations oversee them. But so I haven't seen a lot. I do know some families in a Catholic school here, and I visited an international school where at the international school they were trying to have a no Hagwon rule, but it was sort of gentleman's agreement. I don't think they can enforce it. And I think the Catholic families that I know who chose Catholic school decided, I think they do some Hagwon, but maybe not as much. I think sometimes if you can go to an English language school, that parents want that because then that'll at least alleviate the need for English Hagwon. But I don't know as much about that. Okay, go ahead in the back.
Earlier in your presentation, you said that Korea was placed at #1 in the reading in the 2009 PISA test.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, right, how was the test conducted? Because Koreans in Korean, American in English.
I tried.
Because if that was, I'm wondering if that because Koreans was placed at first, right?
Yeah.
Maybe because the Korean language is very scientific and.
It's a very good question, and you know what? Someone else asked me that the other day, and I realized I didn't know the answer, and I was starting to look it up yesterday when I was putting this together, anticipating this, and I don't have the answer. I don't know exactly how that. Does anyone know how the PISA test works in reading? What exactly it tests, if it's just reading comprehension.
They give the standards years before. It's not a 3-year study.
So it's Korean in Korean language and it's read a passage, answer the questions? Yeah. So it could be because Hangul is, I have no idea. Yeah.
Well, I guess everybody must be very hungry like myself, but I'd like to make one quick comment. While I was listening to your presentation, I asked myself why Korea has been such crazy about education. Well, I think the answer is very simple, because Korea, before during the Japanese ruling, only that a wealthy family could send their children to either Japan or China for better education, and also some independence fighters, they emphasize only the education can free the country from the Japanese the occupation. And after the Korea got liberated from Japan, since Korea was poor economically, and the parents strongly believed only the education can rebuild the country and rebuild the family, the destroyed family. And now Korea is enjoying the prosperity, but since the competition is so strong, the education is closely tied with your success. So someone in the audience said that once you go to college, actually they stop the studying, but now it is not accurate, because I have cousins and nephews in college. They study very hard, because this is directly tied with their survival. Once you fail the college entrance exam, and once you fail to go to like high prominent universities, colleges, then your job is not guaranteed. So this is kind of matter of survival. But in the meantime, in the United States, or like a country like who has a lot of natural resources or a lot of land, you're not that much concerned about getting a good education or going to good schools. But here, that's my observations. Thank you.
And there are a couple more things, and go ahead.
I was just wondering, we keep talking about this new college entrance program, and that it's supposed to create change. What change is it really supposed to create? Are we looking at stopping the hagwons, stopping the acceleration of the competition? I mean, I teach at a school that's privately run, government funded, a lower performing school. So the hagwon system is replaced with the students, including, I have a hostess started with the family of one of my students. And so the hagwon system is replaced with them doing individual self-study at school till 11 or 11:30 every night or later. And the third years were there till 2 a.m. and going back at 6 a.m. So there is no hagwon, but they're doing the same thing. So what is this really supposed to change, other than maybe create some diversity into where they're pulling these students from?
Yeah. Well, the first change, I guess, is they're not spending money to do that studying. Obviously, it doesn't seem like an improvement, right? Because this lifestyle seems like the same. But I think it'll go like this. I mean, there's no infrastructure in place to do anything else at the moment, and there's no payoff yet. So, yeah, there's nowhere to do it. I met this woman who started a hagwon in Hong Kong, which is doing similar things, and it's just for creative writing. And she thinks that there's a new demand for that because the colleges admissions are starting to look at what else can you do, what can you bring that the other kids don't have, are you a good writer? So I'm sure that'll happen here, different kinds of things, yeah. And Scott, you had a question?
Yeah, I just kind of along this idea with the new, we talked about the new college entrance requirements. I've recently read, of course this is happening in different areas in Asia as well, but about the new sort of push to bring in branches of American schools or American universities here to Korea, either to build them in special economic areas or whatever. And I wonder how that might affect. I mean, my understanding is that they'll be applying to these American universities under the American standards, but they'll be able to attend them here at branch universities here in Korea. I'm wondering how that might. Do you have any idea about, have you looked at that? How might that affect this whole?
So they're in Songpa, out by Incheon. There's a. No, it's not Songpa. Where is it? Songdo. Thank you. Songpa is different. It's they'll just reclaim land, and they're building a whole city, and it's super high tech, and they're gonna have a hospital where that actually speaks to the high rises, and they have the anchor of it's going to be this global universities center. And they're recruiting now. They're having trouble recruiting. But they have, I think, SUNY signed on, SUNY Stony Brook, okay. And so it's also very trendy, and maybe maybe it's a trend to stay. I mean, global campuses, they're doing it like in Dubai and the United Arab Emirates, well, Dubai, but they have a lot of space for it, and I guess it's competing with the study abroad, the brain drain. But they also want it to be to attract people from other countries in Asia, to be a destination, and then from that it'll build a research base, so it'll attract industry. So it's kind of a multi-tiered economic development strategy, and gives, if it works, it kind of gives them a kind of a cachet and a big base to grow, keep growing. So yeah, I think it's a good idea. It's a little controversial because some people say, well, they're going for these state universities, right, who there's something in it for them, some prestige, but also some, these are often universities, some of them that they're recruiting don't have a lot of international students there, or aren't very diverse, and that's an attractive thing for a lot of students applying to colleges. So this automatically opens up a whole new world to them. But people say that the Koreans aren't, if they're not a high-name college, the Koreans will be less interested in applying. And it's also going to be very expensive. It's not like that much cheaper to stay in Korea and go to these schools. You save like the plane fare, but not much more. But it's a really big concept thing that could be cool if they pull it off.
Yeah, I think we're running a little bit short on time, and I know that many of you are hungry. I'd like to thank Michael Chandler for speaking. Mrs. Shim, would you like to say anything?
Thank you, everybody here, listening to our forum presenter, Mrs. Chandler. I think she has done a great job in doing her research on Korean education. To me, there is no right way or a right answer to make at the moment. And then also, Korea has a long traditional and cultural heritage. And during the Lee Dynasty, there was a state examination, And then if the people passed the examination, their life was guaranteed to enjoy throughout their life. And that type of tradition has been inherited until now. And then Korean parents do not think their children are someone else. They don't think their children are divided from their body. It's the same, body. And then if their kids do a good job at education, and that is a sign of success for their life. And then this cultural heritage has been ruling most of the families, even if although they are poor or rich, they want to send their kids to Hagwon and then have a special education so that their life can be much, much easier than their own. This is the spirit have inherited a long, long time. And then I don't think this can be disappeared in a moment, no matter what the government tries to do. But anyway, your research was really in-depth and then very worthy to listen to. And then all of us needs to think about what would be the solution in a few years. If a solution can be presented, and then Korean education get better than now, and then educational investment, the amount of educational investment to reduce, it's going to be really ideal. But we all really try hard to find out the way how the Korean education has to be led. So thank you again so much, and enjoy the dinner, not dinner, light snacks. But